Some people are born into safety. Others have to earn every breath they take. Oliver Grant learned that truth long before he even understood what childhood was supposed to feel like. The apartment he grew up in was barely 600 square feet, tucked above a noisy auto repair shop on the edge of town, where the smell of oil and metal clung to the air even through the thin walls. Winters were cold enough that he could see his breath inside, and summers felt like the heat pressed down on his chest without mercy. His parents worked constantly, yet it was never enough, and by the time Oliver was 12, he had already stopped asking for things kids his age would normally want. Instead, he learned how to survive. After school, while other kids were hanging out or going home to dinner, Oliver would rush to his part-time job at a small diner, wiping tables, washing dishes, and sometimes staying past midnight just to earn a few extra dollars. "You're too young to be working this late," a coworker once told him, watching him struggle to keep his eyes open. Oliver had simply smiled, tired but steady. "If I don't, nobody else will." That was the kind of life he knew. Quiet sacrifice, constant effort, and a hope he barely allowed himself to feel. Still, deep down, Oliver carried a simple dream, one he never dared to say out loud. A home of his own, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, where he wouldn't feel like a burden just for existing. That dream felt a little closer the day he met him. It was an ordinary afternoon at the cafe where Oliver had picked up another shift, the kind of place where customers came and went without ever noticing the staff. But this time, someone noticed him. "Hey," the man had said with a small, easy smile, his voice calm and reassuring. "You look like you've been running all day. You should take a break." Oliver had blinked, caught off guard. No one ever said things like that to him. Over time, that man, an alpha with a gentle presence, became a steady part of Oliver's life. He listened when Oliver talked, brought him coffee without being asked, and treated him like someone who mattered. For the first time, Oliver allowed himself to believe in something more than just survival. He started to imagine a future where he wouldn't be alone anymore, where someone would stay, or maybe, just maybe, he could build the kind of family he had always longed for. One quiet evening, sitting side by side on a worn couch, Oliver had whispered, almost afraid of his own words, "Do you think we could have a real home someday?" The alpha had reached for his hand and nodded without hesitation. "Of course, you and me, we'll make it happen." And just like that, Oliver believed him. He believed in the promise, in the warmth, in the idea that after years of struggling, something good had finally found its way to him. One night, in the quiet of that same small apartment, with the world outside faded into silence, Oliver made a choice that came from trust rather than impulse. "I trust you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, searching the alpha's eyes for reassurance. The answer came in a gentle nod, steady and certain. In that moment, Oliver let down every wall he had built over the years and gave himself completely, not out of pressure, but out of hope. Hope that this was the beginning of the life he had been waiting for. He didn't know then how fragile that hope really was, or how quickly everything he had built in his heart could be taken away. But for that moment, in that small, imperfect space, Oliver allowed himself to feel something he had never truly known before. He allowed himself to feel safe. Hope does not shatter all at once. It cracks quietly, one moment at a time, until there is nothing left to hold on to. At first, everything between Oliver and the man he trusted felt steady, almost like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. They spent evenings together after his shifts, sharing simple meals, talking about small things that somehow felt important, and for the first time in his life Oliver felt seen, not as someone struggling to survive, but as someone worth caring about. "You work too hard," the alpha would say, brushing a loose strand of hair from Oliver's face. "One day, I will take you somewhere better." And Oliver believed every word. He held on to those promises like they were the foundation of the future he had always wanted. Weeks turned into months, and slowly Oliver let his guard down, allowing himself to depend on someone else in a way he never had before, until one morning everything changed. It started with a feeling he could not explain, a quiet unease that sat heavy in his chest, followed by days of exhaustion that no amount of rest could fix, and then the realization came in a moment, so still it felt unreal. Oliver stood in the small bathroom of his apartment, staring at the test in his trembling hands, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. "No, this cannot be happening," he whispered, but the answer was already there, clear and undeniable. He was pregnant. For a long moment, he just stood there, trying to process what it meant, fear and hope colliding in equal measure, because this was not just a problem, it was also a possibility, a chance at the family he had always dreamed of. With shaking hands, he went to find the man he loved, rehearsing the words over and over in his mind, hoping, praying, that things would be okay. When he finally told him, everything fell apart faster than Oliver could understand. The warmth in the Alpha's eyes vanished, replaced by something cold and distant. "You are serious?" he asked, his voice sharp in a way Oliver had never heard before. Oliver nodded, clutching his hands together. "I did not plan this, but we can figure it out, right? We said we would build something together." There was a long silence, heavy and suffocating, before the Alpha stepped back as if putting distance between them. "No," he said flatly. "Do not involve me in this. I never agreed to any of this." Oliver felt the ground shift beneath him. "What do you mean?" "This is our child," he said, his voice breaking. But the man only shook his head. "You must have made a mistake. I am not taking responsibility for something I did not ask for." The words hit harder than anything Oliver had ever experienced, not because they were loud, but because they were final. "Please, do not do this," Oliver pleaded, reaching out. But the Alpha turned away without looking back. "Handle it yourself," he said. And just like that, he walked out of Oliver's life as if none of it had ever mattered. The silence that followed felt unbearable, but worse was what came next. When Oliver's family found out, there was no comfort waiting for him, only anger and shame. "How could you bring this disgrace into our home?" his father demanded, his voice filled with disappointment. "We barely have enough to survive, and now this." His mother would not even meet his eyes. "You have ruined everything," she said quietly, which somehow hurt even more. Oliver stood there, shaking, trying to explain, trying to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing left to hold. "I will take responsibility," he said, his voice small but determined. "I will work harder. I will not be a burden." But his words meant nothing. "Get out," his father said firmly. "If you chose this path, then you deal with it alone." And just like that, the place he had called home, no matter how imperfect, was no longer his. With nothing but a small bag in his hands and a future he could not see, Oliver stepped out into the night, carrying not just his own pain, but the fragile life growing inside him, completely alone. Rain has a way of making loneliness feel heavier, and that night it felt like the entire world was pressing down on Oliver's shoulders as he stepped out into the street, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The cold air clung to his skin, soaking through his thin jacket within minutes, each drop of rain hitting him like a quiet reminder that he truly had nothing left. His hands instinctively moved to his stomach, holding it protectively, as if shielding the fragile life inside from everything he could not control. "It is just you and me now," he whispered softly, his voice trembling as much as his body. The streets were nearly empty, the glow of streetlights blurred by the downpour, and the sound of passing cars felt distant and disconnected, like he was no longer part of the world around him. He walked without direction, his shoes heavy with water, each step slower than the last as exhaustion began to take over. Hours seemed to pass, though time no longer made sense, and the cold seeped deep into his bones, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. His vision began to blur, and the ground beneath him felt unsteady, like it could disappear at any moment. Just a little farther, he told himself, though he had no idea where he was going. His body finally gave in when he reached the edge of a quiet street lined with closed storefronts, his foot slipping slightly on the wet pavement before he lost his balance completely. The world tilted, and in the next second, he was on the ground, the impact knocking the air from his lungs as a sharp wave of dizziness washed over him. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled too much to support him. "Please, not like this," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain. The cold pavement pressed against him, and everything around him began to fade into a dull, distant hum. At that same moment, just a few yards away, the glass doors of an upscale restaurant opened, spilling warm light onto the sidewalk. Nathaniel Cross stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his tailored coat after concluding a late meeting with a client, his expression calm but focused as he prepared to leave. He paused when something caught his attention, a figure on the ground, barely visible through the rain. For a split second, he hesitated, as if weighing whether it was his concern, but something about the stillness of that figure made it impossible to ignore. "Hey," he called out, his voice firm but not harsh as he approached, the sound of his footsteps cutting through the rain. There was no response. As he got closer, he realized it was an omega, pale and shaking, curled slightly around his stomach. Nathaniel's expression changed instantly, concern replacing the neutral composure he usually carried. "Can you hear me?" he asked, kneeling beside him, his voice lower now, more careful. Oliver's eyes fluttered open just enough to register the presence beside him, but everything felt distant and heavy. I am okay," he tried to say, though the words came out weak and broken. Nathaniel did not waste another second. "You are not okay," he said quietly, already lifting Oliver into his arms with steady strength, careful not to startle him. Oliver instinctively tensed at first, and used to being held, but the warmth was impossible to resist. "Hospital," Nathaniel said simply, more to himself than to Oliver, as he carried him through the rain toward his car. Oliver barely had the strength to respond, his head resting against Nathaniel's shoulder as the world around him faded into darkness. But for the first time that night, the cold no longer felt as overwhelming, replaced by something unfamiliar yet comforting, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was not completely alone anymore. Warmth returned slowly, like a distant memory Oliver could not quite grasp, the steady hum of hospital machines blending with the faint scent of antiseptic as his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he did not know where he was, his mind still trapped in the cold rain and the empty streets, until the softness beneath him and the quiet beeping beside him pulled him back to reality. He shifted slightly, a small movement that sent a dull ache through his body, and instinctively his hand moved to his stomach. Still there. Still safe. A shaky breath escaped his lips as relief washed over him. "You are awake," a calm voice said nearby, grounding and steady. Oliver turned his head slowly, his vision still slightly blurred, and saw the man from the night before sitting beside the bed, his posture composed but his gaze attentive. Nathaniel Cross. Even in the soft hospital lighting, there was something about him that felt controlled, almost distant, yet not unkind. Oliver blinked, trying to sit up, but Nathaniel immediately leaned forward, placing a gentle hand near his shoulder. "Do not rush," he said quietly. "The doctor said you need rest." Oliver hesitated, then nodded slightly, his voice weak when he finally spoke. "Did you bring me here?" Nathaniel gave a small nod. "You collapsed in the rain. You were running a fever and severely exhausted." There was no judgment in his tone, only simple facts, but it made Oliver lower his gaze, a familiar sense of embarrassment creeping in. "I am sorry," Oliver murmured. "I probably caused trouble." Nathaniel frowned slightly, as if the idea did not sit well with him. "You did not cause trouble. You needed help," he replied, his voice firm but not harsh. A nurse entered briefly, checking Oliver's vitals and offering a reassuring smile. "You are lucky," she said kindly. "Another hour out there, and it could have been much worse. You need to take care of yourself, especially now." Her eyes flickered briefly toward Oliver's stomach, and he nodded quietly, feeling the weight of her words. When she left, silence settled between them again, though it no longer felt as heavy as before. Nathaniel stood, adjusting his coat slightly. "The hospital. Bills are already handled," he said, as if it were nothing more than a routine matter. Oliver's eyes widened immediately. "No, I cannot accept that," he said quickly, panic rising in his chest. "I will find a way to pay you back, I promise." Nathaniel studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "You can barely stand, and you are worried about money," he said, a faint hint of disbelief in his tone. "Focus on getting better first." Oliver clenched his hands slightly, his voice quieter this time. "I do not have anywhere to go," he admitted, the truth falling from his lips before he could stop it. "I lost my job and my home." The words hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Nathaniel did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting slightly, as if considering something carefully. "What is your name?" he asked after a moment. "Oliver. Oliver Grant," he replied softly. Nathaniel nodded once, as if committing it to memory. "Oliver," he repeated, his voice steady. "I have a property in another city. It is quiet, and there is a garden that needs maintenance. Nothing complicated. You would have a place to stay, and you would be paid for your work." Oliver froze, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You are offering me a job?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Nathaniel met his gaze directly. "I am offering you stability," he said simply. "It is your decision." Oliver's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of everything he had lost still fresh, but for the first time since that night, there was something else, something fragile but undeniable. A chance. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening slightly against the blanket. I will do it, he said, his voice trembling but certain. Nathaniel gave a small nod, as if he had expected that answer all along. Then rest, he said calmly. We leave when you are ready. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Oliver allowed himself to believe that maybe his story was not over yet. The journey to Nathaniel's city felt unreal, like Oliver had stepped into someone else's life instead of his own. The scenery outside the car window, slowly changing from crowded streets and worn-down buildings into wide open roads lined with trees and quiet neighborhoods that looked almost untouched by hardship. He sat quietly in the passenger seat, his hands resting protectively over his stomach, still unsure if this was truly happening or if it would all disappear the moment he closed his eyes. Nathaniel drove with calm focus, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting something on the dashboard, his presence steady but not intrusive. Are you comfortable? Nathaniel asked at one point, his voice neutral but attentive. Oliver nodded quickly. Yes, thank you, he replied, still not entirely used to being asked such simple things. The rest of the drive passed in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, until the car finally slowed and turned through a set of large iron gates that opened automatically, revealing a property so vast that Oliver could not take it all in at once. The house stood at the center, a large estate surrounded by carefully maintained grounds, with a garden that stretched farther than he could see from where he sat. His breath caught slightly. This is where you live? He asked, unable to hide the disbelief in his voice. Nathaniel glanced at him briefly. It is one of the properties, he said simply, as if it were nothing extraordinary. Oliver stepped out of the car slowly, his eyes scanning everything around him, the clean pathways, the rows of flowers, the quiet sense of order that felt completely different from anything he had known before. For a moment, he felt out of place, like he did not belong in a place like this. You will get used to it, Nathaniel said, noticing his hesitation. Your room is prepared. You should rest first. Oliver nodded, following him inside, where the interior was just as overwhelming. High ceilings, polished floors, and a quiet atmosphere that made every sound feel softer. A house staff member greeted them briefly, guiding Oliver to a guest room that was larger than the entire apartment he had grown up in. If you need anything, just let us know, the staff member said kindly before leaving him alone. Oliver stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do, then slowly sat down on the edge of the bed, his fingers brushing over the soft fabric as if confirming it was real. This is too much, he whispered to himself. The next morning marked the beginning of his new routine. The garden became his responsibility, a wide space filled with different kinds of flowers arranged in careful patterns, each section requiring attention and care. Oliver approached it with the same determination he had always carried, waking early, moving slowly but steadily, mindful of his condition but unwilling to be idle. As he worked, something inside him began to shift. The quiet, the fresh air, the simple act of nurturing something instead of just surviving. It gave him a sense of peace he had never experienced before. Over time, he learned more about Nathaniel, not from direct conversations, but from small details. The staff spoke of him with respect, mentioning his role as the eldest son of a well-known business family, someone who carried significant responsibility and influence in another city several hours away. Oliver could not fully understand that world, but he recognized the distance between who Nathaniel was and who he himself had always been. Despite that, Nathaniel never treated him differently. Their interactions remained simple, polite, and measured, maintaining a clear boundary between them. Yet there were moments, brief, almost unnoticeable, when Nathaniel would pause near the garden, his gaze lingering just a little longer than necessary as Oliver worked among the flowers, unaware that he was being watched, unaware that in the middle of that vast, quiet estate, he had begun to stand out in a way neither of them fully understood yet. Time passed in a quiet rhythm that Oliver had never known before, each day beginning with soft sunlight filtering through the tall windows and ending with the calm stillness of the estate settling into silence. And for the first time in his life, he was not running from something, but slowly learning how to live within a moment. He woke early out of habit, stepping into the garden while the morning air was still cool, carefully tending to each section with gentle attention, his movements slower, now but more deliberate, mindful of the life growing inside him. At first, Nathaniel's presence in the garden felt coincidental, as if he simply happened to pass by on his way to somewhere else, standing at a distance with his hands in his coat pockets, observing without interrupting. But as the days went on, those moments became more frequent, more intentional. "You are out here early again," Nathaniel said one morning, his voice calm as he approached just close enough to be heard over the soft rustling of leaves. Oliver looked up, slightly startled, then gave a small smile. "It is peaceful in the morning," he replied. "And the flowers respond better when they are cared for before the heat sets in." Nathaniel nodded, though his attention seemed less on the flowers and more on Oliver himself, the way he moved with quiet care, the way his expression softened when he worked. "You know what you are doing," Nathaniel remarked. Oliver hesitated, brushing a bit of dirt from his hands. "I just try my best," he said softly. There was something in that answer that lingered with Nathaniel long after he walked away. As the weeks passed, he found himself drawn back to the garden without reason he could explain, standing there longer each time, watching Oliver in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. He was not used to noticing people like this, not used to the quiet pull that made him pause in the middle of his day just to see if Oliver was there. But Oliver remained unaware, focused on his work, occasionally greeting him with a polite smile, maintaining the same respectful distance that had been there from the beginning. That changed the day Oliver did not appear. Morning passed, then noon, and still no sign of him in the garden. Nathaniel's steps slowed as he looked across the empty space, something in his chest tightening in a way he did not like. "Where is Oliver?" he asked one of the staff members, his tone calm, but sharper than usual. The staff member hesitated slightly. "He is in his room, sir. He has a fever. We told him to rest." Nathaniel's expression shifted immediately, concern replacing the composed neutrality he always carried. Without another word, he turned and headed inside, his pace quicker than before. When he reached Oliver's room, he paused only briefly before knocking once and stepping inside. Oliver was lying on the bed, his face pale, his breathing uneven, clearly trying to rest but unable to fully relax. "You should have told someone sooner," Nathaniel said, his voice quieter now, but carrying a firmness that was difficult to ignore. Oliver opened his eyes slowly, surprised to see him there. "I did not want to cause trouble," he murmured weakly. Nathaniel frowned slightly, stepping closer. "This is not trouble," he replied. "This is your health." He reached for his phone immediately. "I am calling a doctor." Oliver tried to protest. "It is just a fever. I will be fine," but Nathaniel cut him off gently. "No," he said, his tone steady. "You will be properly taken care of." The doctor arrived shortly after, confirming that Oliver needed rest, fluids, and monitoring. Nothing severe, but enough to require attention. Nathaniel remained in the room even after the examination, sitting quietly nearby, occasionally checking on Oliver, making sure he drank water, adjusting the blanket when it slipped. Oliver watched him through half-lidded eyes, confusion mixing with something warmer, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. "Why are you doing this?" Oliver asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel did not answer immediately, his gaze resting on Oliver for a brief moment before he spoke. "Because you need someone to," he said simply. That answer, so direct and unembellished, settled deep within Oliver's chest, and for the first time since he had arrived, the distance between them felt a little smaller, replaced by something fragile, something that neither of them fully understood yet. After Oliver recovered, Nathaniel made his decision clear in a way that left no room for argument, his tone calm, but firm as he stood near the doorway watching Oliver prepare to return to the garden. "You will not be going back out there," Nathaniel said. Oliver paused immediately, turning to face him with quiet confusion. "I am feeling better now," he replied softly. "I can manage." Nathaniel stepped closer, his gaze steady. "This is not about whether you can manage. It is about whether you should," he said. There was a brief silence before he continued, his voice lowering slightly. "You will work inside from now on." Oliver hesitated, unsure how to respond, but Nathaniel did not give him time to refuse. "The study, the office, and my bedroom need regular care. It is lighter work," he added, though the real reason remained unspoken, lingering in the way his eyes stayed on Oliver a moment longer than necessary. Slowly, Oliver nodded. "All right," he said, though a small part of him sensed there was more behind the decision than just concern for his health. From that day forward, their distance began to shrink without either of them fully acknowledging it. Oliver spent his mornings in Nathaniel's study, carefully organizing books and documents, then moved to the office where Nathaniel often worked, their presence overlapping more and more as days passed. At first, Oliver tried to remain quiet and unnoticed, but Nathaniel would occasionally speak, simple observations or instructions that gradually turned into small conversations. You arranged these differently, Nathaniel noted one afternoon, glancing at the shelves. Oliver looked up, slightly nervous. I thought it might be easier to find things this way, he explained. Nathaniel studied the arrangement, then gave a small nod. It is better, he said. That single acknowledgement lingered with Oliver longer than he expected. By the time evening came, Oliver would move to Nathaniel's bedroom, the most personal space of all, where the quiet between them felt different, softer, almost intimate in a way neither of them spoke about. One night, after returning from signing a business contract, Nathaniel pushed open the door to his room and stopped as soon as he stepped inside. Oliver was there, asleep on the sofa, his posture relaxed in a way that was rare, one hand resting gently over his stomach, the warm yellow light from the lamp casting a soft glow across his features. For a moment, Nathaniel did not move. Something about the scene held him in place, the calm, the quiet, the simple presence of Oliver in a space that had always felt empty before. He stepped closer without thinking, his gaze fixed on Oliver's face, noticing details he had never allowed himself to focus on before, the softness of his expression, the quiet strength beneath it. His chest tightened in a way he could not ignore. Slowly, almost carefully, Nathaniel leaned down, his hand resting lightly against the back of the sofa as he closed the distance, and before he could reconsider, he placed a gentle kiss against Oliver's lips, brief and soft, more instinct than intention. In that same instant, Oliver's eyes opened, startled, his breath catching as he realized what had just happened. He sat up slightly, his voice unsteady. I am sorry, I did not mean to fall asleep here, he said quickly, unsure how to react. Nathaniel straightened, but this time he did not step back. Instead, he held Oliver's gaze, his expression serious, his voice calm, but filled with something deeper than before. That is not what matters, he said quietly. Oliver blinked, confused. Then what does, he asked. Nathaniel did not hesitate. I want to take care of you, he said, each word clear and deliberate. And the child you are carrying. Oliver's heart raced, his hands tightening slightly as he tried to process what he was hearing. Why, he whispered. Nathaniel's answer came without hesitation. Not because I have to, he said. Because I want to be with you. The room fell silent, but this time it was not empty. It was filled with something fragile and real, something that made Oliver's defenses waver as he looked at the man standing in front of him, realizing that this was not obligation, not pity, but something entirely different, something he had been too afraid to hope for again. Oliver did not answer right away, his heart racing as Nathaniel's words echoed in his mind, steady and sincere in a way that felt impossible to misunderstand. And for a moment he stood there caught between fear and longing, between the past that had broken him and the possibility of something new. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he nodded. Okay, he whispered, his voice soft but certain enough to carry meaning. That single word changed everything. Not long after, Oliver moved his belongings into Nathaniel's room, a quiet transition that felt far more significant than it appeared, as if he was stepping into a life he had once thought impossible. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt natural, almost effortless, shared meals at the long dining table where conversations started small but gradually grew warmer, moments where their hands would brush accidentally only to linger a second longer than necessary, and quiet evenings where they simply existed in the same space without needing to fill the silence. You should eat more, Nathaniel would say, placing another portion on Oliver's plate without asking. Oliver would smile faintly. I am already eating enough. Not enough, Nathaniel replied calmly, and Oliver no longer argued. Little by little, the distance that once defined them disappeared completely, replaced by a sense of belonging that neither of them had expected, but both had come to rely on. As Oliver's pregnancy progressed, Nathaniel became even more attentive, making sure every detail was taken care of, from regular medical checkups to the smallest comforts at home, never once treating it like an obligation, but rather something he had chosen without hesitation. You do not have to do all of this, Oliver said one evening, watching him prepare everything with quiet focus. Nathaniel did not even look up. I know, he replied simply. That is why I am doing it. Time moved forward gently until the night, everything changed again. It started with a sudden pain that caught Oliver off guard, sharp enough to make him grip the edge of the table as his breathing faltered. Nathaniel, he called out, his voice strained. Nathaniel was at his side immediately, his calm expression replaced with unmistakable urgency. It is time, he asked, already reaching for his coat. Oliver nodded, unable to speak. Within minutes, they were on their way to the hospital, the drive feeling both too fast and not fast enough as Nathaniel kept glancing at Oliver, his hands steady on the wheel, but his eyes filled with concern. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "I am right here." At the hospital, Nathaniel did not leave his side for a single moment, standing close, offering quiet reassurance, holding onto Oliver's hand whenever he could. Hours later, after what felt like an endless stretch of tension and anticipation, the cries of two newborns filled the room, breaking through everything else like a promise fulfilled. "Twins," the doctor announced with a smile. "A boy and a girl." Oliver's eyes filled with tears as he looked at them, overwhelmed by a happiness he had never believed he would experience. Nathaniel stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the children, something soft and unguarded appearing in his expression for the first time. "They are ours now," he said quietly, almost to himself. But that moment of peace did not last. The door opened abruptly, and a voice cut through the room, sharp and unwelcome. "So it is true," the man said, stepping inside with a bitter look in his eyes. Oliver froze instantly, his body going rigid as he recognized the voice he had tried to forget. "You thought you could just disappear?" the man continued, his gaze shifting to the newborns. "Those are mine." The room fell into a tense silence as the past Oliver had escaped suddenly stood right in front of him again, threatening to shatter everything he had just found. The air in the hospital room turned heavy as the man stepped closer, his presence cutting through the fragile peace that had just been built, his eyes filled with resentment and something darker that Oliver recognized all too well. "You think you can just replace me?" he said sharply, his voice rising as he pointed toward the newborns. "Those are my children. You do not get to keep them from me." Oliver instinctively pulled the blanket closer around the twins, his heart pounding as fear crept back into his chest, the past he had tried to escape, now standing right in front of him again. "You said they were not yours," Oliver replied, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry meaning. "You walked away." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "That does not matter now. I am their father. I have rights." Before Oliver could respond, Nathaniel stepped forward, placing himself between them without hesitation, his presence calm but immovable, his voice low and controlled. "You should lower your voice," Nathaniel said. "This is not the place for this." The man's expression twisted slightly. "And who are you supposed to be?" he demanded. Nathaniel did not flinch. "Someone who will not allow you to disrupt this family," he answered simply. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty, and that alone was enough to shift the tension in the room. The man hesitated for a brief moment before speaking again, louder this time. "You think you can just take what is mine?" Nathaniel's gaze sharpened slightly, though his composure never broke. "Nothing here belongs to you," he said, "and that will be made very clear." Within hours, Nathaniel had already taken action, his influence and resources moving quietly but effectively, assigning professionals to look into the man's background without delay. What they found was more than enough. A pattern of deception, repeated financial fraud, theft, and connections to individuals involved in illegal activities, all documented and undeniable. Nathaniel reviewed the report in silence before making a single call. "Proceed," he said calmly. The next day, authorities arrived, handling the situation with professionalism, informing the man of the findings and taking him into custody without unnecessary escalation, leaving no room for argument or resistance. Oliver watched from a distance, holding the twins close, his emotions conflicted but clear enough to understand that this chapter of his life had finally come to an end. Later, when the room was quiet again, Nathaniel returned, his expression softer than before as he approached Oliver. "It is over," he said gently. Oliver looked up at him, his eyes still reflecting everything that had happened. "Thank you," he whispered. Nathaniel shook his head slightly, stepping closer. "You do not need to thank me," he replied. "I chose this." There was a brief silence before he continued, his voice steady but carrying something deeper. "And I will continue to choose this." Oliver's breath caught slightly as he realized what those words meant. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small ring, simple but elegant, and held it out between them. "Oliver," he said quietly, meeting his gaze. "Stay with me. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to be here." Oliver's eyes filled with emotion, his heart racing as he looked at Nathaniel, then at the children in his arms, and finally back at the man who had stood beside him through everything. Slowly, he nodded, his voice soft but certain. "I want to stay." That answer was all Nathaniel needed. In the months that followed, their home became something Oliver had only ever dreamed of, filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet comfort of knowing he was no longer alone. The garden bloomed brighter than ever. The house no longer felt empty, and every day carried a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. In the end, it was not the hardships that defined Oliver's story, but the love that replaced them, a love that was chosen, protected, and built to last.